The Israeli offensive on Gaza shows signs of finally being over. Now the Israeli government and Palestinian armed groups are fighting over who won. But how do you add up the losses and gains of either side? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Divya Gopalan. Palestinian and Israeli negotiators are in Cairo to find a permanent solution to the conflict in the Gaza Strip. Now, with each passing day, the enormity of Israel's assault on the Gaza becomes clearer. Almost 1,900 Palestinians were killed, including up to 400 children, 9,000 injured, and many severely. 40% of the territory's infrastructure has been destroyed, including Gaza's only power station. Those who survived now face an uncertain future as they try to rebuild what's left of their lives. Charles Stratford has this report from Gaza.
The blackened remains of the only source of electricity inside the Gaza Strip. Egypt and Israel are still supplying a little power, but since this plant was hit, 80% of Gaza's 1.8 million people now have only 4 hours of electricity a day. The Israeli military hit Gaza's infrastructure hard.
We pleaded 4 times with the Israeli army not to target us. We coordinated with the United Nations in Gaza. They ignored us. Our early calculations put repair costs at around $10 to $15 million.
The Palestinian Deputy Prime Minister says rebuilding Gaza's infrastructure and the thousands of destroyed homes will cost around $6 billion, and that's just an initial estimate.
Israel said from the very beginning that it was only going to target Hamas military targets. Well, I'm standing on the main road between Gaza City in the north and Khan Yunis in the south, and that road was still being built with Qatar's money. As you can see, it's been hit by a massive Israeli airstrike.
Qatar is already investing around $450 million into building Gaza's infrastructure. Other Arab states, the European Union and Turkey, are also long-established donors. But Israel's blockade of Gaza means people haven't had reliable electricity, water and a sewerage system for 7 years. Around 1 million litres of waste flows into the sea every day. And without enough power to drive the pumps, sewerage now increasingly flows in the streets. The Israeli military has also destroyed many businesses in the private sector.
At least 175 factories have been hit, including manufacturers of medical goods, food and construction products. Israel has to open the borders so we can get the machine and tools in to start rebuilding.
This is what's left of Gaza's largest factory, a family business of 40 years that made biscuits and breads. The owner says just repairing the structural damage could cost $2 million. He says the Israeli military told him repeatedly it wouldn't target the factory.
There are 600 people who work here. What are they going to do now? It's going to take 2 years to rebuild this factory. I give a lot to charity. I can't do that now.
Cement is vital for rebuilding Gaza, and this is what remains of a cement factory. The company had only just finished $3 million worth of repairs from the 2008, 2009 and 2012 conflicts.
This factory has been hit 4 times during the previous wars. It's going to cost me another $1 million to repair this time. We hope the international community can help.
Israel says it's completed the destruction of Hamas's tunnels. It has also destroyed many of the buildings that used to meet the basic needs of Gaza's people. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Gaza.
Well, it's obvious the Palestinians have suffered immensely. If you had to quantify it, 1,886 Palestinians were killed in the month-long assault. The UN says 73% of them were civilians. Some estimates say the 40% of Gaza's infrastructure, including its only power station, was destroyed. As a result, the Palestinian cause has gained a lot, though, of international attention, especially mostly due to social media. Hamas survived the offensive and had tactical success, including the disruption of air traffic at Ben Gurion Airport. Now, Israel says it's pushed its advantage forward during the 30-day conflict. Israel destroyed Hamas' network of tunnels, which it says was an important military objective. The offensive also highlighted the effectiveness of the Iron Dome missile system, which shot down hundreds of Hamas rockets. But what was gained on the military front seemed to have been lost on the political stage, as international condemnation of Israeli actions reached unprecedented levels. 64 Israeli soldiers and 3 civilians were killed during the month-long offensive, and some countries cut off relations with Israel, while others boycotted Israeli products and goods. We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first let's go to Divya Warsi. She's a former British Minister of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Minister for Faith and Communities. Baroness Warsi resigned from the government in protest over Gaza and joins us on the line from Yorkshire. Baroness Warsi, good to have you talk to us today. I want to start with your reason for resignation. David Cameron had said that his government has made it consistently clear about their grave concerns of the heavy toll of civilian casualties, and they've called on Israel to exercise restraint. But you say that the government's actions so far, or inaction, has been morally indefensible. Can you explain that?
Hello, Divya. First of all, I think the issue for me, first of all, in relation to the ceasefire, is that it is good that it's finally holding, and it is good that some progress is being made in relation to the talks. But for me, what is of fundamental importance is that we cannot have a situation in Israel and in Palestine where every 2 years there is this conflict, hundreds and thousands of people lose their lives, and at the end of it, there is a ceasefire and it goes back to business as usual. And one of the things that I was pressing my government on was, first of all, to have stronger language in relation to what was happening in Gaza, a clear condemnation of the actions that had taken place, which had resulted in the deaths of nearly 400 children, and that was not forthcoming. A clearer position in relation to the selling of arms into Israel, and again, that was not forthcoming. And thirdly, clear support for international justice and support for a Human Rights Council resolution which calls for an international inquiry into alleged war crimes.
Now, you've warned that it's not in Britain's national interest and it will have an effect on Britain's reputation internationally by not taking the action that you've outlined. How so?
Well, I was before my resignation, I was a minister with responsibility for the United Nations. I had responsibility for human rights across the world, and I had responsibility for the International Criminal Court. We have very clear values in the United Kingdom. We fundamentally believe in international justice, and we fundamentally promote our values in human rights across the world. What I felt, however, was that our beliefs and our values were not being reflected in the way in which we were responding to Israel. And that is damaging for us internationally. As a minister, when I travel around the world and I talk about our values, we will be accused of hypocrisy and having double standards where we choose to apply principles of human rights and international justice selectively unless we are prepared to apply them in what is happening in Israel and Palestine. And secondly, let's not forget, we have communities in the United Kingdom, indeed across Europe, who were deeply moved by what was happening in Israel. And these are not just communities which have the Muslim faith, but communities from all religions. In fact, we had British Jewish communities who were protesting on the streets.
Indeed. This leads me to the question that the Conservative Party has traditionally had closer ties with Israel, and you knew that when you joined the party. Don't you think that a person like you, with your views, would be needed within the party to temper that, or to bring in another point of view? Don't you think you'd be more effective it would have been more effective for you to have stayed with the party to bring the other side in?
Well, I have served in the front line for my party, both in shadow cabinet as a minister and as a minister in cabinet for the last 7.5 years. During that time, I believe that my party's position in relation to the Middle East peace process has changed. If you go back to 2006, when I was working alongside David Cameron, he spoke very clearly about the disproportionate action of Israel when it was in conflict with Lebanon. If you go back to 2010, when David Cameron first became Prime Minister, he spoke about Gaza as being an open prison because of the blockade. I feel that since then, both our language and our approach has changed. I have done all I can from within the party, and I agree with you. As a politician, my first responsibility was to convince my colleagues, and I had an opportunity to express those views in cabinet, in formal meetings, in informal meetings. But I felt that my government's position was not changing, and at that point I had to make a decision. Was I able to continue supporting a policy and a position which I felt was morally indefensible, or was it the moment for me to say I can no longer stand by this? And I have always said that long after politics has come and gone, I should be able to live with myself. And unfortunately, the government's position was not, I was not sure that I would be able to live with myself if I continued to support it. And therefore, the only natural conclusion and therefore the honourable position was to resign my cabinet position.
Baroness Warsi, good to get you on the show, and thank you for your thoughts. Let's bring in our guest. Joining us live from London, Rafeef Ziadah, Palestinian academic, poet and human rights activist. From Tel Aviv, Dan Gillerman, former Israeli ambassador to the UN. And also from London, Paul Arvanitopolous. He's the founder of Aggelos Consulting, a strategic communications firm. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. I want to start my first question to Mr. Dan Gillerman. If we look at what's happened so far in the past month, since July 8, militarily speaking, Israel has won. They say mission accomplished. But on the international stage, they're facing a lot of criticism, including accusations of a loss of credibility. What's your response?
Well, it is quite obvious that the pictures and the reality coming out of Gaza are horrific. The number of civilians killed is terrible. The fact that so many children were killed is truly heartbreaking. But I think the question the world has to ask itself and hopefully give itself an honest answer to is who is responsible for that? And there is no doubt that the people responsible for these deaths, the people responsible for this horrible, horrible outcome are the Hamas. They are the ones who started this war. They are the ones who have held their own people hostage and as human shields. They are the ones who've placed rockets in homes and mosques and hospitals. They are the ones who've rocketed Israel and shelled Israel with over 3,000 rockets, trying to kill as many women and children as they could. The difference is that Israel had the Iron Dome, which we built to protect our children, and they built rockets in order to try and kill our children and had no regard whatsoever for their own people. So I think that the people of Gaza rightly should feel very furious, very anxious and very angry at the outcome of this, but should realize that the ones who made them subject to this horrible reality are the Hamas, which not only started it, but also refused and reneged on 6 ceasefires which Israel agreed to, and by that just increased that horrible toll.
Now, Rafeef Ziadah, I want to bring you in to respond to this, but also I want you to give us an idea of whether you think, given the current media coverage, people are aligning Gaza with Hamas. Is Hamas a good representative for the people of Gaza?
I find it very disingenuous when people that supporters of Israel say that they are sorry for the death in Gaza and then continue to say they support the government of Israel. Israel is very clearly responsible for the ongoing situation in Gaza and for the 8-year-long siege that has been imposed on the people there. Israel has had an illegal occupation of Gaza and the West Bank long before Hamas even existed, and the Palestinian people have been resisting it ever since. Looking at the utter carnage that has occurred in Gaza, it is very difficult to put the blame on anyone else but the Israeli government and the Israeli military, that it insists on keeping the status quo of an illegal occupation and an illegal apartheid wall in the West Bank, as well as an illegal occupation and a siege of the Gaza Strip, not to mention the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel. So the blame here is squarely with Israel, and people around the world are beginning to notice this. We have had celebrities come out. Here in London, just yesterday we had 8 activists occupying an Israeli arms factory. saying that they do not want this government to keep supporting the arms trade with Israel. So your ordinary people around the world can clearly see past the propaganda lines from Israel and are siding with the Palestinian people.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to bring in Paul Arvanitopolous and just ask you, as a media watcher, and we've heard both points of views, but we've also heard from Rafeef about people's reaction, and a lot of this has to do with the kind of media, the kind of coverage it's getting. If you had to look in from the outside and say who has gained traction from the international perspective, purely on what's being reported and what scenes are being shown, who would it be?
Well, I think you'd possibly say the Palestinian side has gained the greatest sympathy. I think there's a reflexive reaction to sympathise with the underdog. And I think social media has been very disruptive in this regard. It's probably been the first time in the history of Arab-Israeli conflicts that social media has played this kind of role. And it does mean that both sides have to present a more plausible version of reality. So I think it's been very powerful when you've seen images of civilian casualties in that way, which, I mean, the distinction between social media and traditional news media is that the traditional editorial filters are bypassed. So with social media, you get these very graphic, visceral images of casualties, which you wouldn't normally see on traditional broadcast or newspaper reporting. And that does have a very you know, it has a very powerful effect on people who watch this conflict. And I think because of the sort of imbalance in the number of casualties on either side, possibly the sort of the sympathy has fallen towards the Palestinians. I think that's partly reflexive, but I think social media has had that impact, which has been disruptive. There's no doubt about that.
Dan Gillerman, why do you think the media has not treated Hamas as a terrorist organization, as been labeled by the US and parts of the EU and Israel?
Well, I think much of the media has. I think Hamas is widely regarded as a vicious, bloodthirsty, cruel terrorist organization. But, you know, I think that every human being, you know, I'm really sorry. I feel very awkward having to apologize to Rafeef that we did not have more casualties, that we did not succumb to Hamas's horrible attacks, which aimed only at civilians and only at women and children. Luckily, we were able to defend ourselves. But I think the world realizes that while for us, the death of every Palestinian child is a horrible mistake and a tragedy, for the Palestinians, for Hamas, it is a victory and a cause for celebration. They celebrate death. These are the same people who are dancing on the roofs and dishing out candy after 9/11. These are people who celebrate death rather than celebrate life. And
it wasn't just Hamas that, if I may interject, it wasn't just Hamas. There was footage
really
of Israelis celebrating too. We did see that.
To accuse Israel of occupying Gaza, because you know Israel left Gaza, every inch of Gaza in 2005.
Yeah, it's blockaded them. Rafeef, if I may get you to start speaking and just to give your point of view of what's being said, since you were directly.
Israel left Gaza, but it continued. Israel left Gaza. It took its illegal settlers out of the Gaza Strip precisely so it could continue to carpet bomb it whenever it pleased. The occupation of Gaza continues. There's an illegal blockade. Israel controls the airspace, the sea, the water, everything that exits or enters, and it's imposing an inhumane situation on the entire population. I know it's very common for Israel's representatives to keep dehumanizing Palestinians and say we like death, but as I constantly say, the Palestinian people love life, we want life, and we want a dignified
raise your children to be suicide
self-determination, sovereignty on our land. We have every right to be able to live in freedom and in equality. Israel's war was not a war about self-defense. You do not bomb universities and schools and shelters where you have sent people, and you do not tell people to evacuate when you know there's nowhere for them to evacuate. And that's what Israel did. This was a war of aggression against the Palestinian population. It was disproportionate, and it's an act of collective punishment.
Paul Arvanitopolous, I want to bring it back to the whole how it's being viewed from outside. Given the rhetoric we've heard from both sides and the points of views, which both have had a decent stage on across the media everywhere, we've heard the arguments back and forth. How do you think, and you've said it, there has been a lot more sympathy due to social media, due to increased coverage for the Palestinian cause, but does this actually translate to anything?
I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, probably what's important is American public opinion. Whether that's had a huge impact is open to debate at this point. I imagine it has had to some degree. What's difficult is to quantify it exactly. What we have seen is, you've got sort of housewives in Kentucky tweeting about what the situation in Gaza, which is something which is quite unprecedented. So when people go into social media channels and start to open this kind of dialogue, it must have some sort of impact. They're engaging their friends and colleagues in this sort of conversation, this debate, which otherwise they might not be engaged with. The impact, I think we will see the impact it has on public opinion, I think, in the coming weeks and months. But I certainly think it's been very disruptive. It's meant that the traditional news channels, which, all news media is hierarchical and biased to a degree. I think that with Twitter or Facebook, that those hierarchies break down, and it does mean that people can have those conversations. They can have conversations with people in Israel. They can have conversations with people in Gaza, which hitherto they've not been able to have. So I would suggest it would have a potentially quite profound impact on public opinion across the Western world.
Rafeef Ziadah, I want to come back to one of my previous questions to you. We've seen an increase in public opinion, public sympathy, but we've also seen Hamas being associated far more with the people in Gaza. Is that a good representation?
I think people are sympathizing not with Hamas ideologically, but with the Palestinian people that are living under siege and trying to survive. Hamas has gained traction because of the carnage that Israel has inflicted. I don't think it's an ideological support so much as support for a population that's completely under siege and has very rudimentary means of resisting one of the strongest militaries around the world. And I think that's why globally there's now a much stronger push for an arms embargo on Israel. We are hearing it from different quarters in the UK government, and even in the United States, public opinion is turning. The boycotts, divestments and sanctions campaign is really gaining momentum precisely because people are aware that governments around the world are allowing Israel to act and behave in the way it does. They give it the green light. So ordinary people are taking it onto themselves to boycott Israeli products and to make sure that Israel is isolated and no longer armed.
Dan Gillerman, how concerned are you about the international sway, mainly due to, once again, extensive coverage, which has been leaning towards the Palestinians, and hence the ensuing boycotts and possible following sanctions?
Well, I'm very concerned about world public opinion, but I think that when people examine the situation, they will realize who the right side is, and they do already. I can tell you, I'm sure Rafeef knows this. The Palestinians on the West Bank were actually rooting for Israel to destroy Hamas. Their Egyptian brethren, as well as the Saudis and other Gulf states, were rooting for Israel to destroy Hamas. In fact, I think their main complaint is that we did not finish the job. And I truly believe that any talk of boycott or divestment on sanctions is totally unrealistic. I mean, I know Rafeef advocates BDS. I know what BS stands for. I'm not sure what the D is. But, at the end of the day, if Rafeef decides to go ahead with it, she will have to learn to live without her cell phone, without her car, without her medicines, without everyday essentials, because each and every one has Israeli components in it, and I think she will find it very, very
Okay, we're running short of time now, but I want to give Rafeef a quick moment to respond to it. And Rafeef, if you can just briefly give us your response.
Well, I think that was just a very delusional statement about any Palestinian supporting Israel. People in the West Bank went out in protests. We should know because Israel murdered a few Palestinians who went out in protest in the Gaza Strip. The boycotts, divestments and sanctions movement is gaining momentum, Dan, whether you like it or not. The entire world is seeing Israel as a terrorist state for what it is, a rogue state, a state that considers itself above the law. And we will all continue to act until this state is held to account.
Okay,
because no one wants to see this type of destruction.
I'm going to have to wrap up this show. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but it's been a very good discussion. Thank you so much, all of you, for your thoughts and time. I'd like to thank each of my guests personally, Rafeef Ziadah, Dan Gillerman, and Paul Arvanitopolous. And thank you, of course, for watching. You can also leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can go to @AJ Inside Story on Twitter. I'm Divya Gopalan. Goodbye for now.